How far can a helicopter fly? Watch this video. Hello, welcome to the channel. I hope you're all well. So how far can a helicopter fly? What's the maximum distance, the maximum range that a helicopter can fly? So if you watch my previous video, talked about endurance, and that is largely based upon how much fuel you carry on board, or a helicopter carries on board, and at what flight profile they're flying in terms of the power required to maintain that flight. So in terms of range, then each helicopter type will have a certain range figure or certain airspeed that will enable them to fly the maximum range or the best range, best distance, given that the airspeed that they're flying and also the amount of fuel that they have. So this is all to do with fuel burn and also a certain speed at which they can fly. So let's just say, for example, the helicopter flies at 60 knots, which might be great for endurance, but it's not going to be great for distance. It might be great for actual flight time in the air. So let's say if you're orbiting around, doing some aerial survey work, that kind of thing. But in terms of flying a straight distance and getting the furthest that you can, no, it's going to be very, very poor. However, if you're flying at 120 knots, 130 knots, given the same amount of fuel burn, you're actually going to fly a lot further, but your time in the air is going to be substantially reduced. So it's always a trade-off in terms of what kind of flying you want to do, how far you want to get. So these are figures that we can figure out. So there's a certain fuel burn for, let's say, just hovering. There's a certain fuel burn for just loitering around. There's a certain fuel burn for in the cruise. There's a certain fuel for maximum speed. So there's fuel burn, fuel consumption, according to what flight profile you do. So in terms of the maximum distance, again, it depends on the type of helicopter. It depends on how much fuel you have on board. So let's just say for a particular type of helicopter, it can carry a maximum of 100 gallons. I'm just making these figures up over here, of course. So with that particular helicopter, the fuel consumption at a given flight profile might be, let's say, maximum 50 gallons an hour. Therefore, it can fly for 2 hours with that 100 gallons on board in terms of when the helicopter runs dry. So it's got to be on the ground before it runs dry. Therefore, if the helicopter can fly at 120 knots, 120 nautical miles an hour, and that 50-gallon fuel consumption is based on flying at 120 nautical miles an hour. If your flight endurance on that fuel consumption is 2 hours, therefore 120 times 2 is 240 nautical miles. So therefore, that is the maximum distance that that helicopter can fly. Now, there are lots of other variables here that will affect the distance that the helicopter can fly. And one of the biggest things here is atmospheric conditions in terms of temperature, in terms of pressure, air density, but also wind. Wind is a huge factor here in terms of whether the helicopter has a headwind or has a tailwind, especially. So if the helicopter has a headwind, then the helicopter is going to be using a similar amount of fuel because the helicopter still might be flying at 120 knots. And I wouldn't say exactly because there are variables within that too. But let's just say for the sake of this argument, we're saying it's exactly the same. They're still burning 50 gallons an hour. So the endurance is still 2 hours in flight and the helicopter is still flying at 120 knots. But because, let's say, there's a 50-knot headwind, that means that the helicopter is actually only flying 70 knots. So if it's only flying 70 knots, its maximum range, its maximum distance that it can fly within 2 hours is not the 240 as before. It's now 2 times 70, which is 140. So it can be dramatically reduced based upon the headwind. Conversely, if there is a huge tailwind for the helicopter, let's say a 50-knot tailwind, that is pushing the helicopter along as well, that means that the airspeed plus that tailwind component is going to bring the ground speed up to 120 plus 50 is 170. So therefore, do the maths. You've got 340 nautical miles that you can travel for 2 hours. Now, as pilots, we try to make use of this as much as possible. Now, within an operating area, it depends on the operation. It really depends, if you're really going to have to make much use of this wind or not. Certainly, let's say airline pilots would make use of this all the time, and they were trying to fly at different altitudes to maximize the benefit of winds aloft, the winds at a higher altitude. A helicopter's flying at lower level, it can be a factor in terms of maximum range, or it may not. It really depends, as I say, on the operation and the overall distances that you're flying anyway. Helicopters, for the most part, don't tend to fly really long distances, certainly like airliners do. They're much more for shorter distances and particular roles. So the range figure is not necessarily something that we would consider on a daily basis, as would airline pilots, for example. But it's still a factor. So it really depends, let's say, atmospheric conditions, the weight of the helicopter, how much power they're actually pulling to maintain a certain profile, which all affects the fuel consumption. If you're burning more fuel than you normally would, therefore that's going to affect your endurance, and it's going to affect the total distance that you can fly. But the big factor here is, all things being equal, it depends whether you've got a huge headwind or a huge tailwind would overall determine the maximum distance that a helicopter can fly, and actually the maximum distance that an aircraft can fly in general. Hope you found that useful. If you like what I do here, don't forget you can go to the website revelatealf.com/books for my occupational books, aviation books as well. And with that, I'll catch you again in another video coming very soon. Bye now.